Tim, this idea that Jesus Christ was not born on December 25th is going to be shocking to some people. Others, not so much. The internet is filled with all kinds of ideas and theories about when Jesus was born. So I would ask you, are there any of them that you agree with or even partially agree with?
Well, you're hitting the nail right on the head, Michael. This is actually not a new concept. Remember in our previous segment, I mentioned Ezra Stiles, a congregational minister in colonial America. He was questioning it. So this has been a question that's been around for quite some time. And yes, on the internet, 21st century, the theories abound. So let me give you just a quick summary. Let's talk about what season of the year, because the assumption is he was born in winter, right? Mm-hmm. These days, do not encounter a single biblical scholar who still thinks he's born in winter.
Wow, okay.
When it comes to that part of the equation, you've either got someone desperately trying to defend the December 25th birth date, or they've given up. So pretty much no one goes after winter anymore. Likewise, no one pretty much talks about the summer. I'm not aware of any summertime theories that really hold any weight whatsoever. There's a few spring theories, not so bad, but in my opinion, the theory about when he was born is that he was born in the fall, and that also, like we mentioned before, if this is a jigsaw puzzle and we're putting together the pieces to get the picture, the fall is when Jesus was born.
Definitively, you can say that Jesus was born in fall. At first, you were a little vague to me, but I mean, you're dialing it in, so let's continue.
Sure. So the biggest area that we need to start with, however, to correct a common misconception is the year that Jesus was born. See, like we said, this has been around for a minute, okay? This has been around for 200, 300, 400 years that people have been examining, okay, if it wasn't December 25th, then when was it? So back in the 19th century, biblical scholars in the 1800s, they pretty much concluded that Jesus Christ had to have been born earlier than 4 BC. Now let me pause for just a moment and say something to help people understand.
I'm listening.
Because we're talking about dates that are before Christ. They are BC, and they work backwards. So that is not familiar territory to most of us. So when I say it's earlier than 4 BC, that means the numbers go up. Because earlier than 4 BC, that's 5 BC, 6 BC, 7, 8, et cetera, et cetera. If I say later than 4 BC, then that means 3, 2, 1, et cetera.
Understood.
So in the 19th century, in the 1800s, biblical scholars, they had pretty much determined that Jesus had to have been born earlier. The reason they established his birth date as having to be 4 BC or earlier is because there is a mention by the Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus in his work Antiquity of the Jews that there was a lunar eclipse visible in Judea shortly before the death of Herod the Great.
Okay.
So we know from the Bible that Herod the Great was still alive when Jesus was born. So that's pretty simple. If Herod's still alive when Jesus was born, once he's dead, that sets one of the end markers of when we can look for when he was born. So if they determined that Jesus was born earlier than 4 BC, if the lunar eclipse they were talking about was in 4 BC, then that's where they looked.
But the problem with that is what?
Well, the problem with that is they're limiting their scope. Now, granted, I believe they were probably working with the best evidence they had at the time. But we have more, because once again, this is 21st century, right? We have computers, and astronomy plays a big role in determining when Jesus was born, because this is a lunar eclipse. That's part of astronomy, right? Because the stars, the sun, the moon, and the stars, they're like a clock. You can wind them backwards, so to speak, and see exactly where they were when at a certain time. So if we're talking about lunar eclipses in Judea, well, a lunar eclipse, that's a relatively common event. It happens once a year, every couple of years kind of thing. Not super common, but relatively. So what that does is it makes an excellent astronomical marker that we can use to determine when Herod died. The challenge is that earlier biblical historians, they chose the wrong date.
Biblical historians, by choosing the wrong date and sticking to it, they excluded a whole list of possible dates as not being investigated.
Yeah, exactly, that's the case, because like I said, lunar eclipse, great astronomical marker. Uncommon, but common enough that there are several within a general time frame that we should be looking at. And what happened is that these earlier biblical historians, they were probably limited by their resources. We have better resources today. So they were probably limited in their resources, were using the best resources they had available to them. They knew about the eclipse that was visible in Judea in March of 4 BC, so that was the date they picked. But we have better resources available to us, primarily computers. It's really just that simple. A good computer software astronomy program, we can look at many more lunar eclipses visible in Judea during that time frame, and I think that's where we find a better answer.
Tim, if it's critical for us to know when Herod died, then what's the date and how do we know we even have the correct date?
So what we have to do, Michael, is we have to look at these various lunar eclipses. There's only a small handful of them, so we have to determine when they were, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add in some additional details and frankly use the process of elimination to disqualify certain ones.
Okay, I follow you, but what kind of details are we going to put in there?
Well, it's really pretty simple. In the very same record in Josephus, Josephus gives a long list of events that occurred between the eclipse and Passover of that same year. So there has to have been enough time for these events to have occurred. There also can't be too much time because Josephus mentions that they did these things in haste. They did them quickly because the Passover was coming up.
You mentioned they did multiple things in this period of time. Give me an example.
Well, part of our story is about how cruel Herod was. Herod was a very cruel individual. He would eliminate any challenge to his throne. So one of the things that happened between the eclipse and his date is that he executed 2 high priests during that time. He also was seeking to execute one of his own sons at that time, but because Judea was under Roman control, he had to get permission from Rome to do that, so he was waiting for that permission to arrive so he could execute one of his own sons. That's just 2 small events, but it also gives an indication of how cruel Herod was.
That is unbelievable. So he's waiting to get confirmation from Rome that he could kill his own kids,
I know.
High priests. All right, just for sake of argument, let's say that happened quickly. Give me a few more examples of what had to happen.
Well, Herod was also pretty old at this time, and he was very sick. So one of the things he would do is that he would go and seek treatment on the east side of the Dead Sea. They had mineral baths, these hot mineral baths in a town called Carolho. So he would travel there and get treatment in these baths. So he has to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho and then to Carolho and then back between the eclipse and when he dies, let alone there's more events between when he dies and Passover.
Okay, I follow you. So one of the things that you said that intrigued me is it's got to be enough time, but not too much time. So if we're still using the eclipses, fill me in. What are we looking at?
Okay, well, the big event that occurred between Herod's death and Passover that takes up the time is that his family threw him a lavish funeral. So the funeral procession alone took 25 days. 25 days for a funeral procession. So when we look at these candidate dates, if there's not at least 25 days, and
Right.
that's with no margin for error. We got to add more to that because you got the traveling and all this stuff. If there's not at least 30 or more days, 30 or 40 days between the eclipse and Passover, there's just simply isn't enough time for these events to take place.
I understand.
So if we look at these lunar eclipses, there's only 4 of them, and we look at when Passover was of the same year, we can actually eliminate certain ones pretty darn quickly.
Tim, give me these dates and how you know that you can eliminate some of them.
Okay? The first candidate is there was a lunar eclipse on March 23rd of 5 BC. That same year, Passover was also on March 23rd.
Nope.
No way. There was also a lunar eclipse on September 15th of 5 BC, which then would have been followed by Passover on April 11th of 4 BC. The problem with that one, that's too much time.
I follow.
Okay? Now then there's the traditional date. The traditional date, there was a lunar eclipse on March 13th of 4 BC, and then Passover was on April 11th, 4 BC. The challenge there is that's only about 30 days. It just simply isn't enough time for all of these events to have happened.
Tim, the commonly accepted date for Herod's death, and you can see it on Wikipedia.
I know. I don't.
I kid.
I know. I get it.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it's just not enough time. The traditional date of the eclipse, March 13, followed by Passover, April 11, that's only about 30 days. There's just no way that's enough time to get all these events in. So when we look at the one remaining candidate, which is a lunar eclipse that occurred on January 10th of 1 BC, and that Passover occurred on April 8th of 1 BC, that's about 3 months. That's perfect. That's plenty of time for all these things to happen. It's time for, Herod to travel to get his treatments in the salt bath. It's time for him to execute the people he wants to kill. He dies, then they have this lavish funeral, the procession, the whole thing, and then his son has to get confirmed to be the new ruler, and they've got to do all this by the time Passover happens. So the 1 BC, the January 10, 1 BC lunar eclipse has to be the correct date, and that means that Herod died, 3-4 weeks later, late January, early February of 1 BC.
That's interesting. And it's also jumping ahead. 1 BC is not 4 BC. So if we change these dates as our search parameters, what does that mean?
Okay, well that's exactly what it means. It means we change our search parameters. We now have a whole new area that we can look at. So now what we do is we take the other historical documentation we have, we look at the other biblical events that are mentioned, and now we cross-reference them with our new search parameters, right? Like we said before they were always going 4 BC or earlier. Now we can look at between 4 BC and 1 BC. So the first one we're going to look at is we're going to use this opportunity to correct a common misconception.
Okay.
And that common misconception, if you have your traditional nativity scene, your manger set, right, is that the shepherds and the wise men were both in attendance at the birth of Jesus Christ. And the Bible, frankly, plainly teaches us that that was not the case.
Wow. All right. So how are we going to rectify that?
Okay, well, let's start with a quick explanation. For one thing, when the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, they met with Herod, right? Now, Herod freaked out. We're going to talk a lot about that. But they have a discussion, and Herod asked them, exactly when did that star appear? What led you here? And tell me exactly when you saw it. So that he's gathering, what's the word we want to use? Intelligence.
Right.
This is an intelligence briefing for Herod. Because he's going to try to eliminate this threat to his throne. So after this meeting with the wise men, he sets his parameters at 2 years. So if we know that Herod died in early 1 BC, and that Herod set his parameters to kill this young child at 2 years, that's when we should be looking. We should be looking at between 3 BC and 1 BC.
make sure I understand this correctly. So what you're saying is, based upon this research, it shows Herod having died sometime between January 3 BC and January 1 BC. So that expands our parameters, but what does that mean ultimately?
Well, Herod died in early 1 BC. That expands our search parameters based upon his margin for error, because he wanted to kill this young child, right? His margin for error was 2 years. So therefore, our search parameters now should be between January of 3 BC and January of 1 BC. Jesus was born sometime during that time frame. And some additional information that we can add to that is that when the wise men met with Herod, and then Herod sends them to Bethlehem, it says very plainly, both in the English and in the Greek Bible, that the shepherds encountered a baby in a manger, but the Magi encountered a young child living in a house.
Two completely different scenarios.
Exactly, two completely different. And if you look at it in the Greek word that is translated young child, which is repeated like 7 times in Matthew chapter 2, it means a young child. It means a toddler. So it's fair to assume that Jesus was over a year old. He could have been 12, 13, 15 months at this point when the Magi met him in Bethlehem.
That's a lot to take in and not what I expected, but okay. Well, what happens next?
Okay. Well,
what do you have next?
Well, let's add another parameter to it, because people who are familiar even with the traditional story, okay, part of that traditional story is the birth of John the Baptist, okay? His father, Zechariah, was a priest ministering in the temple. He's burning incense in the temple, and he has an angelic visitation. He and his wife had been barren for many years. They're a little bit older, and they don't have any kids, so that's really important to them, and he has this angelic visitation that tells him he's going to have a kid, right? And that child is John the Baptist. Now, part of that story tells us that Elizabeth got pregnant pretty much exactly 6 months before Mary did. But the key to understanding this parameter is that it tells us that Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, was ministering during the course of Abijah.
What is the course of Abijah?
The course of Abijah, or the division of Abijah, is that the Old Testament priests were divided into 24 courses or 24 divisions, and they ministered in the temple 2 weeks per year, but 1 week at a time, twice during the year. So how and when those divisions ministered in the temple follows a certain calendar according to the Hebrew religious tradition. So that kind of tells us at least approximately when Zechariah was ministering in the temple.
Which was?
Which would have been late May or early June of whichever year we're looking at this point, which I believe is 4 BC.
All right, so the course of Abijah that he is involved with is late May to June, 4 BC, and the significance being?
Well, you just got to do the math.
Right.
You know, so it's really pretty simple, because if Zechariah was ministering in the temple,
he's not at home.
Right, he's not at home. He's not very far away, but he's not at home, right? If he's ministering in the temple late May, early June, he ends his service. He's had this amazing angelic visitation, right, that tells him that he and his wife are going to have a kid. So he goes home and?
Nature takes its course.
Of course, right? So that means that Elizabeth becomes pregnant in mid to late June of 4 BC, and that means that if Elizabeth got pregnant 6 months before Mary, add 6 months, you have the time of Jesus' conception, add 9 months to either of them, both of them, and you get the time of their birth.
All right, let's slow down.
Okay?
Let's say what this is. So are you saying that Jesus was conceived in December?
Yes, I am.
Okay, that's interesting. If he was conceived in December, not born in December,
Right.
that makes him born in September?
Correct. So the breakdown goes like this.
Okay.
If John was conceived in June, that means he was born in March.
Right.
If Jesus was conceived 6 months later, that means he was conceived in December. and he was born in September. And if it's within the parameters that we're looking at, that means he was born in September of 3 BC.
You're becoming convincing.
Okay?
What else do you have?
Okay. In one of the other records in the Bible, the record in Luke chapter 2, we're told that at about this time, there went out a decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be taxed, quote unquote. That's the phrase that is used in the King James Bible. But that word taxed is very interesting. We need to take a look at that.
Why is the word taxed interesting?
Because if you look at the various translations in the English Bibles, it's either translated taxed or it's translated census. The Romans were experts at both. Mm-hmm. They were experts at taxation, they were experts at taking censuses, and the intriguing part is they kept really good records. So if you take our search parameters and you look for a taxation or a census at about that time, that would have required Joseph and Mary to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, you don't find one.
Okay, so
that appears problematic until we recognize that if we go into the Greek and we look at the Greek word that is typically translated taxation, it's simply the Greek word apographe, which means a registration. It doesn't mean a taxation. So while a taxation would require registration, or a census would require registration, a registration is not automatically a tax, or it's not automatically a census.
But they still had to travel for it.
They had to travel for it, and that's a big hint because that starts to tell us what to look for. We're looking for a registration of some type that was significant enough that would have required them to travel. Because a taxation, you just go down to the local courthouse and pay your taxes. You don't have to travel to your ancestral hometown to do that. So if we engage in that search, what we find is that in early 2 BC, Caesar was going to be given the title of Pater Patriae by the Senate of Rome, which means father of the country. This was an enormous honor. And what we know in addition is that this required an empire-wide registration of every notable citizen.
Which is the registration that we're looking for.
Exactly, because Joseph and Mary were both of the royal house of David, which means they would have had to have traveled. And we know that the decree went out in the early summer of 3 BC.